Coming up in today's newscast, the United States purchases Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system. The early Likud party list gets published, and fan favorite Israeli music group Shalva backs out of the Eurovision competition.
The IDF responded Wednesday night to a couple of rockets fired at Israel from the Gaza Strip. One reportedly fell in an open field near the Sha'ar HaNegev Regional Council, and no injuries or damages were reported. Another rocket reportedly fell backwards, landing within the Gaza Strip.
Still, red alert sirens were sounded in the southern Gaza border communities, and the army responded against a Hamas guard post in the central Gaza Strip with tank fire. As Hamas is in control of the Gaza Strip, Israel holds the terror group responsible for any attacks emanating from within its territory. But former Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman again criticized the seemingly lax response, saying that confrontation is inevitable and that there's no need to wait for human casualties on our side. Quote, "We must return to a policy of targeted assassinations and massive damage to terrorist infrastructure," end quote. Meanwhile, the IDF also conducted a series of arrests across the West Bank and in the north. On Twitter, the IDF reported overnight that in cooperation with the ISA, the Border Police, and the Israel Police, 8 Palestinians were arrested in the West Bank, and the suspects were all wanted for involvement in terror against civilians and soldiers and other popular violence. The detainees have all since been transferred for questioning too. Then, finally, in the north on Thursday morning, Walla News reported that a Lebanese citizen was arrested after crossing illegally into Israel. The man crossed over near the village of Har Dov, and he's also been transferred for questioning.
It's now been nearly a week since Israel revoked the mandate for the Temporary International Presence in Hebron, or the TIPH, and several international organizations are still heavily protesting the move. In fact, the United States on Wednesday blocked a proposed resolution at the United Nations Security Council condemning Israel's decision to remove the organization. The resolution was introduced last week by Kuwait and Indonesia, among others, in a closed-door Security Council session. And according to the AFP, the statement calls for calm and restraint in the region following Israel's, quote, regretful and unilateral decision, end quote. The resolution goes on to reportedly focus on the importance of the TIPH mandate and its efforts to foster calm in a highly sensitive and fragile area, which now, quote, risks further deterioration as reflected in the escalating cycle of violence, end quote. Turkish officials in the foreign ministry similarly stated that Turkey strongly condemns Israel's termination of the mandate of the TIPH and expects this political decision to be reversed. But critics of the TIPH point out that the so-called temporary force has been in Hebron for over 20 years now, as violence and anti-Israel sentiments have only grown, meaning that this decision is far less political than it may seem. In fact, the TIPH is directly implicated in many incidents that have contributed to the conflict and division in Hebron. Over the summer of 2018, for example, Israeli Chadashot TV News aired footage of a TIPH staffer slapping a young Jewish boy in the face so hard that his kippah or head covering went flying off. Then a few weeks later, a TIPH worker in uniform was caught on video slashing car tires belonging to Israeli settlers. Additionally, TIPH personnel have been accused of often clashing with Israeli soldiers at checkpoints and disrupting security operations. It is this that eventually led Netanyahu to revoke the mandate, explaining that, quote, "we will not allow the continuation of an international force that acts against us," end quote. The Israeli Defense Ministry on Wednesday reported that the United States Army is now purchasing a number of Israel's Iron Dome missile defense batteries for immediate testing and eventual use in a field.
The announcement comes a few months after initial reports on a potential sale were revealed, and after the United States Army requested $373 million from Congress to purchase Iron Dome systems by 2020 as well. And according to an IDF statement, quote, "the Iron Dome systems will be used for deployed United States military forces as a defense system against a wide range of ballistics and airborne threats, and they'll be tested in the long run as part of a range of possible United States military responses to aerial threats," end quote. Now, Prime Minister and Defense Minister Netanyahu, among others, already praised the purchase, calling it a great achievement for Israel and lauding how, quote, "this is yet another expression of the strengthening of our strong alliance with the U.S. and an expression of Israel's rising status in the world." Netanyahu continued that Israel has an Iron Dome and an Iron Fist, and our systems know how to deal with any threat, quote, "both defensive and offensive. I would not recommend our enemies to try us," end quote. Israeli ambassador to the UN Dani Danon similarly tweeted then that this decision improves the bond between the countries and that Israel's powerful tech will now help the United States defeat its enemies. Further, after the announcement was made, the IDF also released this promotional video on how important the Iron Dome system is and how it saves lives. The Iron Dome works by tracking incoming short-range projectiles by radar, and then it maps out the trajectory of the rocket and predicts where it will land before deciding whether or not to intercept. Additionally, to date, the Iron Dome system has reportedly intercepted over 2,000 rockets from Gaza alone. As for longer-range threats, the Iron Dome system works in tandem with the Arrow, David Sling, and various other interception systems. Still, for the United States, the Iron Dome is enough for now, and United States Army Colonel Patrick Sieber explained on Wednesday that the Iron Dome will be assessed and experimented as a system that is currently available to protect deployed United States military service members against a wide variety of indirect fire threats and aerial threats, adding that while Iron Dome has been in operational use by the Israeli Air Force since 2011 and proven effective in combat, it should be noted that the U.S. Army will assess a variety of other options for its long-term indirect fire protection capability, or IFPC solution, as well.
And now joining us with more on the recent American purchase of the Iron Dome system is founder and executive director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, Dr. Martin Sherman. Dr. Sherman, as always, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me back.
All right, so first of all, what are some of the major implications of this purchase, be it politically, economically, security-wise, etc.?
Well, I suppose, obviously, we should relate to this with good news, positive development. It certainly underscores and cements Israel's status as a leading technological power on the global stage. Politically, I think it's obviously another feather in Netanyahu's cap, who's been scoring up a string of security and particularly diplomatic successes over the last few weeks, or the last few months. In Africa, in South America, particularly with Brazil, India. So this is another feather in his cap, and probably, something that's going to help him along the way in the elections.
So do you see Israel maybe expanding on this sale and selling, as many Iron Domes as is possible, or is Israel more selective with who can acquire it? Because the United States is not the only country that's been working with Israel.
That's true. I should imagine there are security-related issues here that you don't really want too much of the technology to leak out. You have to be sure that the purchaser is not going to have a lax security system which will allow information to reach people that you don't want it to reach. So there are certain restrictions. But I should imagine that there would be other markets.
So, okay, now, speaking again of the United States' plans for the Iron Dome system, as they stated, they said they want to test it offensively and defensively in the field, and really expand on it. Of course, they also said that they're testing with other defense systems as well. But with the Iron Dome, does this say anything about maybe backtracking on the Syria withdrawal?
Well, it's difficult to say at this moment. The only thing we know about Trump is that you should expect the unexpected. But just going back to what we were talking about before, you talked about political implications. I think in many ways this deal is a very strong answer to Netanyahu's critics, who were afraid that his clash with Obama would undermine U.S.-Israeli relations. And I think this is a very strong response to that, which totally repudiates that fear. Going back to what you asked before, it's interesting to say, what do they mean by defensive and offensive use of the Iron Dome? In Israel, it's been totally defensive, which I think in many ways is a misuse of the Iron Dome, because the Iron Dome has actually protected the Palestinians more than it's protected the Israelis in a certain sense. Because if you didn't have the Iron Domes, you would have to go into Gaza and seize the area where these rockets are being fired from. The fact that we were able to minimize it has actually protected the Palestinians from that kind of large-scale offensive. What the United States might be thinking of is doing what I think is the real strategic role for the Iron Dome, is to keep your population and your forces safe whilst you actually do take the areas where these rockets are being fired from. Because basically what you're seeing is today is very expensive rockets being used to intercept very cheap rockets, and you wonder how long this can go on for, especially with the kind of arsenals that we're seeing being massed against Israel. But that's an interesting point about what the United States is saying, is that they're going to use it for offensive means. Maybe that's what they mean. They want to keep the troops and the civilian centers safe whilst they
mount an attack.
Whilst they mount an attack to neutralize the launching zones.
Well, it'll be very interesting to find out. I'm sure we will at some point or another with this sale. Dr. Sherman, as always, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Moving on, it's been just days since Prime Minister Netanyahu scheduled meetings with Russian President Vladimir Putin on February 21st in Moscow. And while there, the two are set to discuss Iran's growing presence in Syria. But now it seems that Russia and Iran will also be discussing Israel's anti-Iranian strikes in the region at a trilateral summit in Sochi next week.
Israeli leaders have admitted to hundreds of strikes against Iranian and Iranian proxy targets in Syria over the past few years, and Netanyahu has often vowed to continue to operate in the region as often as is necessary. Well, according to Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, officials from Iran, Russia, and Turkey will all convene then on February 14th to discuss with the Russians, quote, the Israeli attacks on Syria, adding that Iran will respond to the Israeli attacks in a timely manner and in accordance with national interests. That being said, the stated primary focus of the meeting in Sochi will be to form the Syrian Constitutional Commission tasked with ending the Syrian civil war. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, Iranian proxy terror group Hezbollah is already using its new sway in the Lebanese government to ask for weapons from their Iranian benefactors. In fact, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah on Wednesday challenged the Lebanese government to cooperate more fully with Iran, saying he wants to confront Israeli aircraft on Iran's behalf, and that he's willing to do, quote, whatever the Lebanese army needs to do to become the largest regional army, end quote. Actually, Nasrallah even spent over a full hour on a televised address praising Iran and the Ayatollah regime's accomplishments. This just after denying Israeli allegations that Hezbollah is just Iran's arm in Lebanon and in the newly formed Lebanese parliament.
Iran has proxies. One of them is Hezbollah. Hezbollah just joined the government of Lebanon. That's a misnomer. They actually control the government of Lebanon. And that means that Iran controls the government of Lebanon. And it's important to send this very powerful message. Just as we stopped the terror tunnels coming into Israel, we will stop all the aggression from Lebanon or from Syria or from Iran itself. We're committed to preventing this aggression, and in so doing, we're not only protecting ourselves, Israel itself, but also protecting our neighbors and world peace.
All right, now the final votes have been confirmed for the Likud party primaries after nearly 70,000 eligible Israeli voters submitted their ballots. And with 30 expected seats in the Knesset, the final Likud list has just been published.
Many of Netanyahu's loyalists and veteran Likud members took top spots, including Knesset Speaker Yuli Edelstein, Transportation Minister Israel Katz, Public Security Minister Gilad Erdan, and Culture Minister Miri Regev. Gideon Sa'ar, who took fourth place despite Netanyahu campaigning against him, is the only one in the top 10 who really poses any opposition to the prime minister. Netanyahu took this as a win, however, since at least Sa'ar did not take first. But the biggest news may not be with who did make the party list out of the 142 candidates who ran. Actually, the headlines are mostly in who didn't make the list, as multiple popular representatives were either left off completely or were so low down that they wouldn't likely have much power. Veteran Druze lawmaker and communications minister Ayub Kara, for example, anti-tobacco MK Yehuda Glick, anti-BDS MK Anat Berko, and many others were excluded from the top 30 slots. And Oren Chazan, who has a long history of offenses in the Knesset, was also voted out, though that may not offend too many people, as he's already been banned multiple times from the Knesset even when he was an active MK. Then there are also Knesset members like Sharen Haskel, who wasn't voted off of the list but came in 29th, which is considered too far down in rank to really have any sway. With her at 29th place and Glick out completely, though, the Likud now doesn't have any Anglo representation either. The only way this could change then is if Prime Minister Netanyahu appoints Deputy Minister at the Prime Minister's office Michael Oren to the spot on the list that is reserved for a party member of his choice.
In other election-related news, Prime Minister Netanyahu took a moment after the Likud primaries to thank his constituents for making their voices heard. But he also took the opportunity to issue a harsh warning against his biggest rival at the moment, former IDF chief Benny Gantz.
אני מאוד מאוד מרוצה, כי מתפקדי הליכוד בחרו באופן מדויק ודמוקרטי רשימה חזקה, מרשימה, טובה לישראל, והם גם הצביעו בעד ההצעה שלי. אבל הצרה היא שגם אבו מאזן מרוצה, כי בני גנץ אמר היום שהוא יבצע התנתקות שנייה ביהודה ושומרון. ואבו מאזן החל לו הצלחה בבחירות, ולכן אנחנו חייבים ללכת יחד, לנצח את הבחירות האלה ולמנוע את זה. וזוהי התמצית האמיתית של הבחירות. ממשלת שמאל בראשות בני גנץ, או ממשלת ליכוד בראשותי.
Netanyahu's comments come just moments after Gantz spoke to Yediot Ahronot News, where the Israeli Resilience Party leader alluded to the idea that we must find a solution to the conflict that does not require Israel to, quote, exercise control over other people. Netanyahu was also then responding to PA spokesperson Nabil Abu Rudaini, in which he said it was encouraging to hear a former IDF chief suggest that he might cede territory in the West Bank. Gantz and his party have since fired back at Netanyahu's claims, though, saying that in 2004 the government voted on the disengagement plan from Gaza and Netanyahu voted for it, adding that Netanyahu evacuated Jews and paid protection money to Hamas. Quote, "Your time is up, we are moving onwards," end quote. Gantz then went on to clarify his comments, saying that under his government there would be no unilateral actions related to the evacuation of settlements. Regardless of the political mudslinging, though, Gantz expressed that he thinks Netanyahu took on the most difficult job in the state of Israel and gave his all. Quote, "I consider him a patriot and I do not hate Netanyahu, but I think it is time for him to step down in a dignified way," end quote. Now in other news, 19-year-old Israeli combat soldier Sergeant Lynn Levkov was killed Wednesday morning after she was struck by a Palestinian driver near the Jordan Valley. Police have already ruled out terrorism as a motive, however, marking this instead as a tragic yet simple accident. Magen David Adom paramedics and Army first responders were quick to the scene on Route 90 near the Beit HaArava junction, but they ultimately failed in their attempts to resuscitate Levkov, who was promoted posthumously to the rank of sergeant from corporal. And as expected, family and friends of the Tel Aviv native are still in shock. Prime Minister Netanyahu, among many others, though, eulogized Levkov already, saying that, quote, "On behalf of all the citizens of Israel, I send condolences to the family of the late Sergeant Lynn Levkov, a combat soldier in the Lviv Valley Brigade, whose short life was cut off today in a road accident in the Jordan Valley," end quote. She was later buried Wednesday night at the Kiryat Shaul Military Cemetery. 67-year-old Rabbi Yechiel Eckstein, the founder and president of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, passed away from cardiac arrest Wednesday afternoon in his home in Jerusalem.
And in addition to having founded the IFCJ back in 1983, the American rabbi served on the board of many Jewish organizations and brought an abundant amount of donations to Israel, totaling well over $1.3 billion. Rabbi Eckstein also facilitated Jewish immigration to Israel and financially helped lone soldiers as well as many other people in need. That's why countless people expressed deep sorrows in regards to his passing, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who expressed great gratitude towards Eckstein's life of action, saying that, quote, "He worked very hard to benefit the citizens of Israel and to strengthen the connections between the Christian communities and Israel. May his memory be a blessing," end quote. Additionally, judging by the amount of support received within just hours of his death by Jewish organizations all around the world, one can see just how massive an effect Eckstein really had on the community. President Reuven Rivlin also issued a statement lamenting the death of a, quote, "great man, a great Jew, and a great Zionist. He will be felt for generations," end quote. He also called him a man of charity and vision, saying, "May his memory be a blessing." Rabbi Eckstein will be laid to rest on Thursday in Jerusalem. May he rest in peace.
After a few days of pleasant, warm weather, Israel was struck by thunderstorms and other heavy rainfalls Thursday morning, causing major flooding in the southern part of the country. Because of this, major highways were also blocked and the Ein Gedi National Park was shut down to the public. Now on Wednesday, the Israeli police anticipated the storms and called on all citizens to drive carefully and avoid traveling on flooded roadways, adding that there was a risk of slipping, drifting, and even drowning. Then, as predicted, both the Negev and Judean deserts were heavily flooded overnight, forcing police to close a section of Route 40 in the Arava Desert and a section of Route 90 near the Dead Sea. Additionally, the Nature and Parks Authority shut down some touristic destinations, among them the Ein Gedi National Park and the Masada Hilltop Fortress. These two locations in the Judean desert get flooded very easily, though, because the terrain in the area stops absorbing water very quickly. On top of that, Ein Gedi was also affected with a major power outage, while other major hiking sites like the Nachal Zin, Nachal Huarim, and Nachal Davshon, among others, were flooded too. Meanwhile, in the southern town of Mitzpe Ramon, known by travelers for outlooking over the Ramon crater, close to 18 millimeters of rainfall was measured overnight, making up a fourth of the annual average. Floods aren't something unusual in this area either, though. Just last year, 10 Israeli teenagers were tragically killed during a school outing when they were swept away in a flash flood by the Dead Sea, and many others were killed by flooding near the Dead Sea in Jordan as well, including when over 20 people, most of them school children, died after their bus was swept away. The Shalva band, popular contestants on Israel's show Rising Star, have officially backed out of the Eurovision qualifying competition due to the failed attempts at changing the EBU's rehearsal times away from the Sabbath. The Eurovision finals are held Saturday night, which is fine, but rehearsals fall on Friday night, just after the Shabbat enters. And being that some members of the band are observant Jews, they were hoping for an exception to be made. Unfortunately, however, Eurovision officials were not open to the idea, which has forced the band to back out.
The good news, though, is that we will still likely see them perform, as according to Hebrew language media reports, the Shalva band will come back as guest artists during the Eurovision semifinals on May 16th. On another note, though, the contest's organizers at the Eurovision Broadcasting Union, or the EBU, are reportedly very upset with Netanyahu's refusal to budget proper security costs for the event. John Ola Sand, the contest supervisor, penned a letter to Netanyahu, Finance Minister Moshe Kahlon, and Communications Minister Ayub Kara, and in it, Sand claims that at a meeting in October, Netanyahu assured him that the government would cover the costs for security, adding that he urges Netanyahu not to go back on his word. Sand also states that Israel, quote, cannot shirk its responsibilities, pushing Netanyahu to take charge of the security situation. Finally, he said that the EBU has had many participating countries reach out to find out about security for the festival, and that having a commitment from the government would, quote, greatly soothe the countries sending delegations to Israel, end quote. Well, according to Channel 12 News, the Prime Minister's office reportedly responded that, quote, the Israel police is currently carrying out thorough work to formulate the security needs and costs required for arranging the Eurovision events in Israel, and when the work is completed, the subject will be examined and budget sources will be summarized, end quote.
Finally, in yet another example of Israel's growing positive relations, direct flights from Tel Aviv to Tokyo, Japan have just been announced for as early as September, cutting off at least 4 hours from the average travel time today. The announcement came at a ceremony in Israel's embassy in Tokyo earlier this week, where Israeli ambassador to Japan Yafi Ben-Ari and Japanese tourism and travel officials stood proudly side by side. And while there, the group explained that the flights will begin taking off on September 13th, and they'll be operated by Sandor Airlines, a subsidiary of Israel's El Al. Ben-Ari then added that the first flights will be charter flights organized by Japanese travel agencies, and that, quote, charter flights are the first step towards achieving our main objective, regular direct flights between the two countries. These flights will help put Israel on the Japanese tourist map and signal to the local market that Israel is an attractive destination. In parallel, Israeli tourists will benefit from a shorter and more comfortable route to Japan, a growing destination for outgoing tourism from Israel, end quote. In fact, the direct flights will likely only take 11.5 hours as opposed to the 15 to 16 hours it currently takes to fly today, including a stopover in Warsaw, Poland. And as indicated at the ceremony, tourism between the two nations has indeed been growing rapidly over the past few years. According to Globe's Israel, in 2018, 20,000 Japanese tourists visited the Jewish state in 2018, up 15% from the year before. Likewise, 35,000 Israelis visited Japan, more than double the number from 5 years ago. And now for our Hebrew word of the day, new direct flights between Tel Aviv and Tokyo have just been announced, but a shorter travel time isn't the only thing that can either make or break a comfortable flight. There are also professionals who make sure that we're taken care of while high in the sky, and we call them dayalim or stewards. Now, a dayal, or a flight attendant or steward, is responsible for a lot more than just bringing us drinks and pointing towards the exits. Your nearest dayelet, or stewardess, is also responsible for helping you find your seats, settling passenger disputes, providing specific help to passengers who need it, monitoring for cabin safety and help, and much, much, much more. And perhaps toughest of all, a good dayal or attendant is also expected to do all of this with a smile. So next time you find yourself traveling, be nice to your dayalim or attendants. You never really know what craziness that they've been dealing with. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight is expected to be clear and cool with a low of 52 or 11 degrees Celsius. Then over the weekend, you can expect scattered showers and a high of about 62 or 17 degrees Celsius. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.63 shekels to the American dollar. Remember to sign up for our daily newsletter at iltv.tv. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook at Israel English News and on Twitter at ILTV News. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you for watching.